this afternoon. I wanted to get maximum crowd, and you all have turned out in great numbers. Thank you. So this is our second to the last program, Hidden Gems, and then we have a kicker in September. Tonight, of course, we have Ellie Thomas, who's going to talk to us about her trips around the high parts of the nation on the trails. And then next week is Taylor Bruce, who is going to talk to us. He's going to educate us the same way he had to educate himself on bees. He knew nothing about bees when he started, and now he has, I think it's hundreds of thousands of bees. So you have to be careful on his property. And then in September, on a date that I don't have written down, great, but it's at 4:30 in the afternoon. Just come every Sunday afternoon. No, it's not Tuesday, it's a surprise. This is kind of a pop-up gems. We're doing a 9th gem, whereas we've only done 8 in the previous years. And that is going to be Bob Carroll, who has actually made a film with the assistance of AI. It's quite something. And it shows the history of our area, not so much the club like we learned last week, but the history of slavery, of the Indians, of Reconstruction. It's very interesting and a real technical eye-opener that somebody our age can figure this stuff out. So, and this evening, Ellie, who has the distinction of being the second child of for the Gems. We had Peterson, Guy's son, not Norman. Nolan, thank you. And he talked to us about his experience in the Ukrainian war as a correspondent. And now we have Ellie as the daughter of Lee Thomas and Dorothy. Please excuse me, I'm filling in here for joy and forgetting my lines. So her presentation is about through hiking the Triple Crown of the U.S. of trails. That includes the Appalachian Trails and the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail. She has hiked all of these in the past 16 years, some more than once, and she's going to share with us the lessons that she's learned along the way and also some really stunning photographs. So after 30 years in corporate America, where she spent time in the field of environmental operations, Ellie turned to real estate and to market trading, not so much to make a living, but to support her habit, which was hiking and biking these wonderful trails. And she's doing a good job of it. So having now achieved the triple crown of U.S. through hiking, she is now turning her attention to adventure motorcycling with her brother. And will soon, she doesn't do small stuff, she will soon turn her attention to embarking on a 3 to 4 week bike tour in Australia. Can you do that entire continent in 3 to 4 weeks? Maybe she'll give us a little preview. But before we let her go off on that adventure, let's listen to her tales of a solo hiker here at home and share her fabulous slides and the lessons that she has learned along the way. Ellie.
Good afternoon. I appreciate everybody being here for my presentation on the Triple Crown, what I expected versus what I learned. Before I start, I'd like to take just a moment to recognize my father. He's been one of my biggest supporters over the years, and his words have traveled with me on every trail. Ellie, I'm not sure this is such a good idea. There have been many, many moments on the trails where I've heard those whispers in my ear. And he's even hiked some of the trails with me. Dad's hiked the Appalachian Trail with me. We did a section probably about 4 or 5 years ago near here in North Carolina. I thought it was great. It was a 4-day section that turned into a 2.5-day section. It's cold and rainy, but Dad was a good sport. He can probably tell you, it's a long story. He can probably tell you a story about it. But we really enjoyed it, and he's always been very supportive through all my hikes, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. The Triple Crown is 3 national scenic trails here in the United States. The Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Continental Divide Trail. And I say them in that order because that's usually how they're hiked. Usually people start with the Appalachian Trail because the logistics is easier. They move to the Pacific Crest Trail, and then they hike the Continental Divide Trail, which is arguably one of the hardest of the 3 trails. Across the 3 trails, before I start with the Appalachian Trail, there's about 8,000 miles of hiking across 22 different states. Each one probably takes between anywhere from 4 to 6 months. I did each one in about 5 months. My first trail was the Appalachian Trail. It was established in 1937 and is about 2,200 miles long. The total elevation gain is over 400,000 feet. And it's equal to climbing Mount Everest about 16 times. It's the longest hiking-only footpath in the world. It travels through 14 states, with the highest point being Clingman's Dome in Tennessee. The lowest point is Bear Mountain in New York. About 20% is estimated of the people that start the Appalachian Trail finish it. It's the same for the Pacific Crest Trail. No one's really sure about the Continental Divide Trail, but I've always heard probably about 400 or 500 people start that trail every year. And I think there's some people here who have hiked the Appalachian Trail and may know the statistics a little more than me. I think about maybe 20,000 people start the Appalachian Trail. It's a much busier trail than the other 2. There's a lot more people on that. The Appalachian Trail is a very social trail. And as I go through the presentation, I'll tell you a story about each one of the trails rather than just going through a lot of the statistics and numbers and those types of things. And I'll just kind of weave in a few facts here and there. But it is a very social trail. And these are 3 young men that I met on the Appalachian Trail. We were hiking. I met them over the course of the beginning of the trail. I chose, as words were whispered in my ear, to start at the beginning of February. And southern winters are pretty brutal. So at the point that I'd met these young men, we were just approaching Tennessee and the Great Smoky Mountains. And it was pretty cold. By the time we had reached the Smokies, it was probably down into the teens and approaching the single digits. We were still low enough in elevation to where there was rain, and fortunately, there were shelters that we could stay in along the way. The Appalachian Trail has shelters about every 8 to 12 miles. They're 3-sided structures, and a lot of people do stay in these shelters, but I do not. And the reason I don't is because they're often rodent infested, and they're often full. I mean, there's usually a lot of people in them. In the Smokies, you're required to stay in the shelters unless they're full, and then you can camp. And they're just always full when I get there, so I'll always end up camping, whether they're full or not. So I met these 3 young men. It had gotten colder and colder as we had moved through the Smokies, and we got to just outside of Gatlinburg. And it was at this point that all of our gear was wet. It had rained for 2 days, and they asked me, they said, Ellie, do you want to go to Gatlinburg with us? And we'll stay there, and then we'll come out tomorrow morning because one of them's grandparents had a condominium. So we ended up going, the trail always provides. So we went into Gatlinburg, and the next morning we came out, and the rain had changed to snow. And we were continuing to move up in elevation. At this point, one of the young men, and everybody on the Appalachian Trail has trail names, and they're usually associated with something that occurred on the trail. His name was Man Cub. It was Man Cub, Mr. Friendly, and Sats, and they had all started hiking together and asked me if I'd like to join them for the next 2 days because the weather was supposed to continue to deteriorate. So we decided that we would hike together and that we would hike into the night to try and get through the next 35 miles overnight and get down to lower elevations because the temperatures were supposed to drop into the single digits. And this was in 2023. At this point, I had already hiked tens of thousands of miles, so you would think that I had learned something along the way. And we hiked into the evening, temperatures dropped, and by probably 10 o'clock, I was so cold that I couldn't even talk. And I noticed that the young men kept dropping back to hike with me. They would hike ahead, and they would drop back and chit-chat, and then hike ahead, switch off, drop back. One of them dropped back, and I had stopped to rearrange my gear, and he started talking to me, and I couldn't respond. My speech was slurred, and I was having a very hard time communicating with him. And his name was Stats, his trail name was Stats. And he looked at me, and he said, "Let's run." And I said, okay. So I was beginning to suffer from hypothermia. So we started hiking very, very quickly, and we started to run, and the next shelter was probably about 8 miles away. So they continued to switch off and hike with me, and I just hiked as fast as I could. I had on every article of clothing that I could wear, and was staying as warm as I could possibly stay. Once we got to the shelter, I had a 15-degree sleeping bag. I had on all my clothes, including my rain gear. It kept me alive, but it didn't keep me warm. So, I guess the moral of the story was that no matter how many miles you hike and no matter how many years you hike, these trails will humble you very quickly. And in this case, the weather had changed more drastically than we had anticipated, and there was really nowhere for me to go except forward. And that was often the case in different situations on the trail. So we hiked into the evening, we got to the shelter, it was already full. The people that were in there moved over and let us in, which was good, so it kept me warmer throughout the evening. And then the next morning, we got up probably at 5 a.m. and then hiked down out of the mountains. So we got to much lower elevations, but it was a pretty scary situation. And I would say amongst all three of the trails, probably the AT has taught me the most lessons when it involves weather. The weather comes in, other than lightning and high elevations in the Rockies and the Sierras out west, but the weather usually comes in fast, and when it's cold, it's very humid, and it can be very dangerous. And you can become hypothermic under 50 degrees. It doesn't have to be below freezing. The Pacific Crest Trail is on the west coast. It also was designated a National Scenic Trail in 1968. It is about 2,650 miles long. The total elevation gain is 390,000 feet. It is equal to about 17 times, which probably should be more like 15 times on Mount Everest, and it crosses 3 states. The highest point is Forester Pass in the Sierras, and the lowest point is the Columbia River Gorge right on the border of Washington State and Oregon. It passes through 7 national parks and 25 national forests, and it's graded for stock, so it's about 15 degrees. And what's nice about the Pacific Crest Trail is that it's primarily above tree line. It is a stunning trail. It goes through the Sierra Nevadas, the Cascades, the Mojave Desert. You've got alpine lakes that are just pristine. And then you've got just the beautiful high desert in Southern California, which is the first 700 miles. It is what I consider the easiest of the 3 trails. It's still a difficult trail, but when people ask me, young people especially, what's the first trail that I should hike? If I want to hike the Triple Crown and I want a long distance hike, which one should it be? I usually tell them the Pacific Crest Trail. The logistics are a little bit harder, but all of the towns have what are called resupply options, which is where you go in and you get your food, you clean up, and then you head out. And typically, a resupply occurs every 3 to 5 days. Most towns have grocery stores, but some do not. And when they don't, I'll mail the box ahead, and the post offices will hold them for me for up to 30 days if I mark them general delivery. So I'll mail the packages, pick them up, and then move on. And the Pacific Crest Trail makes that logistics, even though it's further between the towns, much easier. Probably, again, about 20% of the people that start that hike finish that hike. These are some of the scenes. This is me in the high Sierras. Sunset in the desert. The high desert was absolutely beautiful. And this is also the high Sierras. The high Sierras, I think, are one of the most beautiful sections of the Pacific Crest Trail. Now, I was in Central California, near Chester, California, near Lassen National Park, when I got lost. which is hard to do on the Pacific Crest Trail. Because much like the Appalachian Trail, it's a very clear trail. The Appalachian Trail has white blazes on the trees every 100 yards. So it's very difficult to get lost, but it does happen. And there have been some pretty tragic circumstances on the AT from people getting lost, especially up north in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. And the Pacific Crest Trail, although not marked, the trail is very clear, probably because stock uses it too. So I was around Lassen National Park. I took a wrong turn somewhere, and I came out on a dirt road. And I knew that I was near Chester, and I'd sent a box to Chester, and I was out of food, so I needed to get there. I pulled out my maps. I plotted a path straight through the woods. I was going to take a shortcut. Heard those words whispered in my ear. I was going to take a shortcut and cut through the woods over to the Feather River. 2.5, 3 hours later, I was scratched, I was bleeding, I was sweaty, and I couldn't get a good bearing because I was just surrounded by trees. I was up on a ridge when I saw a glint off of what was either metal or glass and headed down off the ridge and saw a small A-frame house with a brand new Cadillac sitting in the front yard. And all I could think was meth lab. You know, I'm just not in the right place. And this was that house. So I circled around through the woods, I circled around through the woods and I came out to the dirt road and I stood there studying the house, and I needed to go ask them where I was because I wasn't sure that I was on the road. I thought I was, but I wasn't positive, and there was also no river. So I needed to find out where I was. The first sign I saw as I stood there was this, so I relaxed. I'm like, how dangerous can they be? How dangerous can they be? The second sign I saw was this one. So I just had this image of this cowgirl with a rifle laying in wait. So I walked up to the house. There was a stream flowing in front and what appeared to be a handicap ramp. And as I walked up on the porch, I glanced in the window and I saw what appeared to be an elderly, bald-headed man sitting on a bed in the middle of a room. So I immediately stepped over in front of the door. I didn't want to be intrusive and looked back and he was gone. And it was like something straight out of a horror movie. So I knocked on the door and I heard a woman yell, "Come in." It was the last house at the end of the road. So she probably thought anyone coming out there was coming to see her. So I yelled back, "You don't know me." And then I heard this just ka-thump, ka-thump, ka-thump. I just had this image of a peg leg or a rifle or something heavy being dragged towards the door. And this is who answered. Yeah. And her name was Barbara Frost, and she was the matriarch of Stump Ranch, which was about 250 acres near Chester, and she had lived there since 1941. And she opened the door and she looked at me, and she said, "You're lost." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "The trail hadn't come through here in years." And I said, "Well," I said, "Hi, my name's Ellie." And she put a set of car keys in my hand. And she said, "Come on inside and sit on that sofa over there, but grab the photo album out of the chest of drawers before you sit down." I said, "Yes, ma'am." So I sat down, and so I got the photo album, sat down, and she had just page after page of Polaroids of hikers from the 70s and 80s with those big external frame packs and boots, and all of them had their names and dates written on the back. And she came and sat beside me, and we went through them for probably 15 or 20 minutes, and abruptly she just stood up and she said, let's go into town. And I said, well, where are we going? And she said, are you that lost? And I said, well, I just want to make sure we're going to the same town. And she said, Chester. I said, that's it, that's where we're going. So we went out to the car, and as we were getting in the Cadillac, the windows were down. I heard her yell, Ellie. And as I looked in the window, I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? And this was during the Obama era. And at this point, I had learned that Southern California was pretty conservative. And so I said, a Republican. And she just looked at me. She said, get in. So I got in the car, and she looked at me, and she said, I don't believe you, but you're young and stupid, and it doesn't matter. I said, yes, ma'am. So we headed off down the road, and we went into Chester, which I was pretty excited about. I was going to get there early, I could eat, I could clean up, and leave the next morning. That was not how things went. We went to the grocery store first, and then the post office, and then the hardware store, and any number of other stores, and she would hand me a list and some cash, and she would sit in the car while I went in and did all her shopping. And when I came out, there were always 2 or 3 people gathered around her car, and when we left, she would give me the full rundown on who they were, what they did, how long they had lived there, right or wrong. But she clearly was well known in the town. When we finished, I took her to lunch, and we sat there for about an hour, and I learned a lot. She told me all about her 3 husbands, and one she had married out of necessity, another one convenience, and another one she loved. And when I had been in her house, I noticed a bear pelt on the floor, and I asked her about that. And I said, where did the bear come from that was on your floor? And she said, well, I shot it. And I said, huh? She said, yes, I shot it when I was 82. And she said I was much better shot several years ago. I said, and I was just speechless. I didn't know what to say. So I, stupidly said, well, what kind of gun did you use? And she huffed up and she said, well, I used my assault rifle, my SKS, before that stupid governor told me what kind of gun I could and could not have at my home. And yes, ma'am. At this point, I was just a little speechless, and I just listened. And I then said, well, another dumb question. I said, isn't it illegal to shoot black bears in this part of California? And she looked at me and she said, you're sweet, but you're not too smart. And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, we practice the 3S rule here. And I said, well, I of course did not know what that was. And she said, shoot, shovel, and shut up. I said, I see. Okay. And I learned a lot that day. I learned a lot about California, and I learned a lot about rural California. And I walked her back to the car, and I remember her well. And she, as I was walking away, she called me back, and she said, you listen. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, I never left that ranch. She said, life got in the way, and I never left. She said, so you do your hikes, and you take your memories, and you keep them with them for the rest of your life, because when things aren't good, you're going to need them. I said, yes, ma'am. And about 7 years later, I wrote an article about meeting her, put it on my blog post. I got a lot of messages from her family, and they had somehow on the internet found this article I'd written and thanked me for writing about their mother. And they said, she's been gone now for 3 years, but it's nice to know that she impacted other people and her legacy continues. So that was nice. The Continental Divide Trail I love the Appalachian Trail, and I've hiked the Appalachian Trail 3.5 times. It's my favorite. But the Continental Divide Trail was it's a different trail, because when I hiked it, only about 50% of it was single track. The rest of it was either old Forest Service roads or, in some cases, paved roads. You had to do road walks. Now it's probably about 69% single track. It was established in 1978. It's 3,100 miles long, The official trail is 3,100 miles long, but it's very much a create your own adventure type of trail. And most people, when they talk about the Continental Divide Trail, the mantra is embrace the brutality, because it is a brutal trail. You know, Appalachian Trail is no pain, no rain, no pain, no main. And the Continental Divide Trail is embrace the brutality. But it appeals to my personality, and I love the adventure of that trail. It was a trail I had a lot of fun on. And I have some good memories from that trail also. The highest point is Grace Peak. I'm scared of heights. So that was a very difficult height for me, the Rockies were. I would say this was probably, from that perspective, one of the hardest hikes. The lowest point is 4,200 feet in the Chihuahuan Desert, which Dad refers to as an armpit. But the desert is my favorite. I love desert hiking, and I really enjoy it. Dad does not. There's only estimated probably about 400 hikers that attempt it. And when I hiked it in 2009, I maybe saw 10 to 12 other hikers. I would go weeks without seeing other hikers. Even in town, I wouldn't see other hikers. But I met so many good people, ranchers and farmers and hunters, and I just had wonderful experiences on this trail. The difference between this trail, for me, and the other two trails, the biggest difference was the wildlife. So I was very much aware of the fact by the time that I finished the trail that I was not the apex predator out there. I had an encounter, and I'll go over it in just a minute, but the wildlife was very present the whole time that I was on this trail. And that was both in the southern parts of the trail in the desert and in the northern parts, especially in Montana and Wyoming. The grizzlies, I think, in Wyoming and Montana, there were not supposed to be grizzlies in the mid-state, in mid-Wyoming. They were only in Montana. I saw at least 3. In fact, I saw more grizzlies in Wyoming than I actually saw in Montana. Yeah. I was in the Great Divide Basin on July 4th of 2009. And I don't know if we have any horse people here, but I grew up with a quarter horse that my father bought for me. And I always loved horses. You know, I was hiking through the Great Divide Basin, and I was on a spur off of this road here when I heard a scream up to my right. And I looked up, and I saw these mares. The only reason I knew they were mares, because they weren't quite close enough to tell, is they have a couple of foals, which are over to the left in this picture. And as I hiked through the Great Divide Basin, I encountered mustangs many times, and they always traveled in small herds. And they were calling out. I just didn't know for what. And as I stood there, over to my left, I heard a noise in the distance, and I looked off, and I saw a really small white speck that was getting bigger. It was coming towards me. And it was this horse, and it was a stallion. And over the next probably 15 minutes, he just circled me screaming. And, you know, he was there to protect his bears, and they had called him when they had seen me. And I didn't realize just how dangerous they can be. And he got very close, and he circled, and I tried to remain calm and just keep walking, and I had bear spray at that point, so I had my bear spray aimed at him as I walked. And all of a sudden, he turned and took off. And this man pulled up in his truck, and I hadn't seen another person in 3 days. His name was John, and he was a rancher, and he wanted to know just what the heck I was doing out there. And he also wanted to make sure I was okay, as most of the ranchers I met did, because he said that stallions could be very dangerous, especially the Mustangs. Yeah, I just didn't realize that. And you know, we ended up spending an hour sitting on the tailgate of his truck talking about his family and his kids, and he pulled out the most amazing cooler. It had deli meats, dried cheeses, and dried meats, and pale ale. And after an hour was up and 2 pale ales, I tottered off down the trail. But that was kind of a thing, you know, whenever I was in a tight position on the trail, there always seemed to be someone nearby. There always seemed to be a person. People always ask me if I felt unsafe. And I will say there has been one instance that I felt unsafe on the Appalachian Trail, but for the most part, and the most dangerous animal is, of course, the two-legged animal. It's not the four-legged ones you have to worry about. But in 99% of the instances that I was out on all three of the trails, people like him were referred to as trail angels. And they're people that just stop and help and provide out of the goodness of their heart. And John was one of these people. I'm sorry, Mike. So that was one of my experiences on that trail. This is another one. I was south of Yellowstone. This is a wildlife experience. I was south of Yellowstone, and I came over a hill. I was probably about 20 miles south of Heart Lake, which is in the back country of Yellowstone Park. I think about 20 miles. And I saw this, and I had no idea what it was. I was far enough away. I had my zoom lens, which is the only reason they're going to be close. And I stood there for a minute, and I realized it was a bear. And I assumed, based on his color, that he was a grizzly. I've seen tons of black bear, but not with quite this color, and he was very large too. So he rolled around for a minute, and I stood there for 15 minutes, and I'm not very patient, and I had my hiking poles, and I clapped him, and he ignored me. He could care less, and I clapped him again. At that point, he stood up, and he took a look at me, and then he walked away. He was a big boy. And he walked over a small hill, and I waited about 10 minutes, and then I continued on, and I heard a noise up to my right, and I looked up, and he was in the trees, rubbing up against the bushes and the tree trunks, and basically exhibiting very territorial, what I thought was very territorial behavior. So I waited, and I had my camera in one hand, not probably the smartest move. I had my pole stuffed under my arm, and I had my bear spray out. And all I could think about was a conversation I had about 4 days earlier with a rancher who asked me a question. He said, "Do you carry bear spray?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he started laughing. And he said, "Do you carry a gun?" And I said, "No, sir." And he started laughing. And he said, "That's good, because both of them are just going to piss the grizzly off." And as I stood there watching, that's all that kept going through my mind, is I'm just going to piss him off, I'm just going to piss him off. So he roamed around through the trees, and after about 10 minutes, I finally decided he was far enough away where I could get by. And I had my bear spray out, and I started to pass him, and as I passed, he was standing up on his hind legs, rubbing on a tree. He dropped to all fours and charged. And as he charged, he made a huffing noise. You've seen a dog, but the dogs playing where they kind of huff and bounce, and he did the same thing. And he got close enough where I could see his eyes, and I could actually smell that kind of musky, old wet rug smell I guess they have. And I just froze and screamed as loud as I could, "Stop." I didn't know what else to do. I was not going to spray my bear spray. I didn't want to irritate the bear, and you know, you don't know how you're going to react in those situations until they happen. But I had been taught all my life, by my grandparents especially, and by my parents, number one, don't be prey. I knew not to run, and so I just tried to be loud and big, and if that didn't work, I knew to just drop to the ground and cover the back of my neck and my head with a grizzly. In the case of a black bear, you run, or you fight back. But in case of a grizzly, you just try to protect yourself. And right as he got to me, he swerved away from me. I saw when I screamed, his eyes just kind of widened, and he swerved around me onto the trail, and stood there, and then sat down like a big dog and just kind of cocked his head and looked at me. And I just had my bear spray and my poles, and I just started walking very slowly and as calmly as I could until I got to the edge of the trees, and I looked back, and he was following me, and he was walking with me. And I got about 10 yards out into the field, and he stopped at the edge of the trees, and he didn't follow me anymore. And I then hiked about 20 miles in like, I swear, 3 or 4 hours. Until I got to Heart Lake, and there was a ranger station there, and I showed him the pictures of the bear, and he told me that it was probably a 3-year-old male. He had just left his sow, or his mother, and was establishing his territory. And the only reason he stopped was because he didn't know what I was. And I probably startled him when I yelled. So he said you were very fortunate that he stopped, and that he was a sub-adult. He called him a sub-adult. So that's probably the scariest I've had other wildlife encounters, but that was probably the scariest wildlife encounter that I've had on the trails. So what I found, the trails, they're beautiful. This is in Killington in Vermont. This is in Maine. Maine was one of my absolute favorite states. This is a picture from North Carolina. These are the layers, the Blue Ridge. And again, I'm showing you the Pacific Crest. I went into these hikes. I started the Triple Crown, and I expected to be self-reliant. I hiked most all of the trails solo. I expected to really have to rely on my resiliency and my endurance, and I was going to handle whatever those trails had to throw at me. But I was quickly humbled by the trails. They taught me a lot of humility. And for me, personally, the biggest surprise was that the most memorable experiences weren't the wildlife, and they weren't the wilderness. They were the people, and they were the community. And I realized that, without that community and without those people, and I literally have hundreds of other stories of people and trail angels that helped me along the way. And even my most recent trail, which was last year, I did about 1,200 miles on the Continental Divide Trail. There's at least 5 or 6 stories from those trails of people that just help out of the goodness of their heart. They'll invite you I had ranchers bring me into their homes, pluck me out of thunderstorms, pluck me out of rivers. It's pretty amazing what people will do for hikers, or a person they feel in need. But for me, that was probably the biggest kind of eye-opener. I'm an introvert, so I always thought that I could do everything solo myself and didn't need help. And these trails really taught me how important people and community are, and that you can't do everything by yourself. I didn't do thousands of miles by myself. I did it with a lot of support along the way. And the last thing I'll show you is probably one of the biggest things that I learned for all the gearheads in here is exactly what I did not need hiking. This was my first pack in 1998 when we went southbound on the AT. And it was probably around between 60 and 70 pounds. This is not fully loaded, but I think if I tried to carry this now, I just would die. There's just no way I could. Last year I did the Continental Divide Trail, and this was my pack. Yeah, so gear has changed a lot, but what I've really learned is how little I need and how much I don't need to be safe and to be comfortable on the trails. Now, experience teaches you what you do and don't need and what you can and can't be comfortable with. But yeah, I think this pack right here, when it's fully loaded for about 3 or 4 days with food and water, is probably about 25 pounds. All right. Questions? So the Continental Divide Trail is a designated national scenic trail, but only about 69% of that trail is what's called single track or an actual trail. Yeah, the rest of it is roads and dirt roads, and in some cases it travels over private property, so they have not established a trail yet, unlike the AT and the Pacific, or the Appalachian Trail and Pacific Crest Trail. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is the John Muir Trail part of the Pacific Trail?
There is a part of it that runs along with the Pacific Crest Trail, I believe, yes, near Mount Whitney in the Sierra Nevadas. It's supposedly a beautiful trail. I haven't hiked the John Muir, primarily because I did the Pacific Crest. Yes, ma'am.
How many miles did you try and do a day?
My longest day ever hiked is 42 miles. That was out of necessity, and it was out west. And ranchers are very particular about their private property, and I couldn't find a place to camp. I ended up camping in a ditch outside of Anaconda, Montana, where the mayor found me the next morning. Another story. But I usually try to average around 20 miles a day. When I was younger, I could, on the trails like the Continental Divide, Pacific Crest, I could do around 30 miles a day. If it wasn't too brutal. And then there's parts of the AT where I couldn't do over 8 to 10 miles once I get up into Maine and New Hampshire. Yes, sir.
Have you thought about any foreign country trails, doing that? What is your next step?
I've got a long list. I'd love to try some of the Caminos, especially the Portugal Camino. The Dolomites, I talked to someone earlier about that, and they're a beautiful mountain range. I'd love to hike up there. The Tororora is supposed to be which is in New Zealand, is supposed to be the hardest long distance hiking trail in the world, amongst the long distance hiking trails. And 10 years ago, I probably would not have had any issues, but now I hiked the AT again in 2023 and got Lyme's disease. Yeah, and the doctor told me based on my blood work I had it before, but this time it actually affected me, and I lost hearing in my left ear and got tinnitus, but the worst thing was it affected my balance. So I've been kind of recovering from that, and I'm not sure I could do a trail like that again, but I want to do the Pacific Northwest Trail, which goes across the top of the country, and the Oregon Desert Trail. Those are the next two, which I hope to do next year.
Do you take a satellite phone?
I do. I have a, let's see, I think I have it here. Dad insisted that I carry a GPS locator with me. So it's very small, and he not only insisted, but he also logs in every day so that he can see the dot on the screen as it moves across the country. It sends a signal every 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Ellie,
Yes.
where did this all come from? This desire to just walk and hike? Where did it start?
That is Dad's fault. Between buying us motorcycles and horses and camping, we always enjoyed the outdoors, and my grandparents are outdoors people also. So I think I just grew up appreciating outdoors.
Would you please describe some of the meals and the food that you take?
That has also evolved. I usually, when I first started backpacking, and even now, I would take dehydrated meals and just boil some water and pour it into the meal. I would eat a lot of ramen. I would eat a lot of rice, because often not many towns have camping stores that sell the dehydrated meals. Now I don't cook anymore. Now I eat a lot of snacks, and I find that it maintains my energy level much better than eating, meals 3 times a day. If I do want a meal, then I usually just cold soak. I carry a little peanut butter jar, and I'll cold soak ramen or rice, and it's room temp, but it's almost as good as cooking it. And I don't have to carry the stove, and I don't have to carry the gas, which is why the pack stays small. I'm more conscious of weight now than I used to be.
Keep enough water with you.
I carry a lot. In sections like through the desert, the Chihuahuan Desert and the Mojave Desert, there was, I think the most I ever carried was in Southern California, and I had to carry 8 liters. And that was very heavy. That was a lot of water. But most of the time, I'll do what we call camel up at the water source, drink as much water as I can hold, and then I usually carry 2 liters. And I have maps and an app, and usually have a pretty good idea of where the next water source is. I have run into problems, yes. Yes, sir.
Ellie, so you on the Appalachian Trail, there were 3 young men, and you had a difficulty, and it kept dropping back.
Mm-hmm.
If they weren't there, what would have happened?
I don't. When I started to slur my words and I started to get really tired, I was ready to sit down. I was tired. I wanted to sit down. I wanted to stop. And stats, encouraged me, run, let's go, let's move. And I've had situations like that before. When I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, I was young, I knew everything. And I was starting, again, best decision, I started the last week in May. At one point, I had a little thermometer I carried with me. It's at 117 degrees down in the Mojave Desert. So I started hiking at night instead of during the day. And I came close in a couple instances there to running out of water. Last year on the Continental Divide Trail, I cached water because I knew there would not be any water. I took gallon jugs and I cached them every 20 miles along the trail. And when I got to the second one, which was 40 miles from where I had started, an animal had eaten, and I've got it on video, and because I kept a video log on YouTube, an animal had eaten a hole in the jug, and there was no water left. And I had 4 ounces in a little bottle. So I had to hike 20 miles with basically no water. And I was pretty sick the next day from it. And when I got to a road, someone had put 3 jugs of water there. And I drank a full gallon and never had to go to the bathroom. My body just completely absorbed it. Yeah. So I've been in bad situations. I've either been lucky or been able to just push through most of them. Yeah.
You hiked each of these trails, and did you hike them sectionally, or did you start at a point and just through hike to the end? And how long did that take?
Each one took about 5 months. I through hiked them, but I did do what's called flip-flop, meaning because of timing. So I finished my MBA and actually skipped the graduation to go hike the Pacific Crest Trail because I was so nervous about timing and I really wanted to go hike. And I started in the South, and because I started so late, I hiked up to Reno where my little brother picked me up, and then I flew up to Canada. My brother picked me up and started up there and came back down to Reno.
So that one you did.
Met in the middle.
Either end.
Yeah. And then on the Continental Divide, I hiked up to Darby, Montana, flipped up to the border, met another brother of mine who wanted to hike Glacier National Park, and came back down to Darby. Yeah.
How many pairs of shoes and boots you say you went through? What was your favorite pair?
I started in Solomon's. Recently, a few years ago, used Hoka's, and currently use Topos. And I use Topos because the toe box is so large and my feet are destroyed. So I've gone up 2 shoe sizes and it's permanent now. So I wear Topos. And I probably go through, because of the foot damage I have, I switch out my shoes every 500 miles, whether I need to or not. Because even if the shoe looks fine, it compacts as you hike, and it makes a big difference. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you talk about your Australian adventure that you're planning?
Well, it's preliminary, and my brother rides all over the world, and he rides a BMW motorcycle, and he's done it for decades, and he's always pestered me to ride with him. But I've always been too busy hiking, and recently I've noticed, my knees have gotten a little more sore, my feet are a little more sore, and hey, that sounds like fun. So I bought an adventure, I got my license, took a safety course, bought my adventure motorcycle last year. He tried to get me to go to Thailand with him this year, but I thought that I needed a little more practice. So we're going to do Australia next year, and I think he wants to do it with a tour company, and it's about 3 weeks. And since we're already there, we'll probably do New Zealand after that. And I don't have much more information. He's the planner.
That was gonna be my question.
Okay.
You said you had the scariest experience on the Appalachian Trail. I don't imagine what would be scarier than that grizzly experience.
It was unsafe. Yes, it was when I first started backpacking. I was in Tennessee, and I went to cross a dirt road, and there was a white van. Sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. Coming, rattling down the road. I don't know if I've told you this story. And a man pulled up in front of me and asked me if I needed a ride. And he was clearly drunk. And I said, I'm waiting on my friends who are right behind me. And he said, well, I think you should get in. I'm going to give you a ride. And I said, no, sir. I said, my friends will be here in just a second. At that point, he jumped out of his van, and he had one of those, not a tire iron, but the plug The far way? Yeah, Love Ranch, Love, whatever. Anyway, he kind of staggered, ran around the van, and I still had my pack on, so, and this was a long time ago, so it was probably 50 pounds. But I was much younger, much fitter, and he was very inebriated. So I just kicked him as hard as I could, and he went down, and I just took off running back up the mountain the way I'd come from. And once I got over the ridge, and I didn't know if he was following me or not, but once I got over the ridge, I looked back and I didn't see him, so I took a hard left and went off into the woods as far as I could go where you couldn't see me from the trail, and I just lay down and just waited. And I could still hear the engine from his van, and I heard him leave. And then I was just, at that point, I was just terrified, so I just stayed there. I laid out my ground sheet and my sleeping bag, and I was just going to cowboy camp for the night. And he came back, probably a couple hours later, right at dark, and started shooting, I guess, a handgun. I don't know a lot about guns, but some kind of gun into the air. And he only stayed there for about 15 minutes, and then he left again. So as far as the most terrifying thing that's happened to me on the trail, especially as a young person, that was probably it. Yeah.
You had a lot of angels out there with you.
Ma'am?
You had a lot of angels out there with you.
I did. You know, I have my own set of rules, especially as a female. I very much follow my intuition, but I also don't camp within a lot of people like to camp near the roads. You know, they're hitching into town, or trail angels bring them food, that type of thing. I don't camp within 2 miles of a road. And when I do camp, I typically go off trail. A lot of trails like you to use designated areas so you don't negatively impact other areas, but for safety reasons, I don't stay in designated areas. I do what's called stealth camp to just not be seen from the trail. And I think because of that, I have not had any issues other than that one with a human. Yeah. I have seen tons of snakes. Yeah, lots of rattlesnakes. No, you know, I sleep now. I just use a tarp. I don't use a tent anymore, and I use an inflatable pad. And I have never had a snake bother me. They don't usually want anything to do with me. I've seen tons of rattlesnakes and almost stepped on many rattlesnakes, but they usually keep their distance. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You seem like a very social person.
Mm-hmm.
It seems almost like you like to hike on your own.
I prefer to.
And why is that?
Because there's no agenda. I can start when I want to start. I can stop when I want to stop. I see a lot more wildlife, and the positive encounters I have with people, I think, happen because I'm solo. But I do hike with people. I'll meet people, and we'll have a good connection, and we'll hike for a few days together, or even a few weeks together. Much more so recently than when I was younger on the western trails. But I usually see people throughout the day, and I guess maybe because I'm an introvert, that's usually enough for me. Yeah. When I'm hiking.
Do you stay in touch with any of the people?
I do. I love young people. And I did when I worked in corporate America too. I love training. I love working with young people, and I love the young people I meet on the trails. And you know, I try to help where I can. And a lot of the young people that I meet, not a lot, but some of the young people that I meet are either coming from tough relationships or tough situations. They're trying to figure things out, and you know, I'm not all-knowing and wise, but it's still nice to meet them and talk to them and help where I can. So I really enjoy the young people on the trail. So. Thank you.
One more? Yeah, come on. Did you have another?
Yes. What were your most difficult river crossings?
When I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, I decided to take the old Pacific Crest Trail instead of taking an alternate, because I don't remember why I made that decision at the time. I was told not to, but I did it anyway. And it was near Mount Hood, and there was a huge river, and everybody, and the bridge had been washed away, but through the hiker grapevine, someone told me there was a large tree that had fallen, and I have a picture of it. And so I got to the river, and I could hear the boulders under the white water just crashing into each other. I was young, I was dumb, and if I say now I would do that again, I would be lying. I look back at some of the things I've done over the years, and I can't believe I did them. And I shimmied across that tree probably 30 yards to get across that river. That was probably the most dangerous river crossing I've had. And one of them was in the Wind River Range, and I came to a creek, which was maybe 10 yards at the most, and it looked like nothing. It looked like just something very simple. And so I leaped off the bank, and it was as if someone had shot a fire hose through that creek, and it just swept my feet right out from under me and pulled me under and slammed me into a boulder. And I couldn't get my head above water because I had my pack on, and there was so much water pressure. A shift in the current, an angel, I don't know. Something happened that pushed me off that boulder, and I reached up and grabbed some willow branches and managed to pull myself up on the other side. Those are the two scariest things that happened.
Well, we all hope that your next appearance will be a book signing. You definitely have a lot of tales to tell that we've probably just scratched the surface. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much.